Approximately 1 million acres of the Appalachian forest have been removed by surface mining. In this episode, we speak with Michael French, who is the Director of Operations of the organization Green Forest Works. Reforestation efforts play a large role in mitigating climate-related issues. Since 2009, Green Forest Works planted more than 5 million trees across more than 9,400 acres. Green Forest Works is effectively addressing two needs of the region. First, the reforestation projects provide local jobs. And secondly, together with the local communities, they improve the environment by eradicating non-native species and restoring ecosystem.
Green Forest's work, our mission is to restore healthy, productive forests on formerly mined lands in the Appalachian region. And it really goes back to the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. That's a federal law that was passed to standardize reclamation or mined land remediation processes across the nation for coal surface mines. Before that, the laws were left up to the states. Some states had fairly stringent laws. Some states were pretty lax with their laws. But in the Appalachian region, which is a mountainous region of the US, the steep topography there, I guess it really requires some background on the mining and how that process happened. But before the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, reforestation of surface mines was pretty common across the Appalachian region. But there were a lot of other problems associated with coal surface mining at the time. So when mining companies would come into an area to mine the coal, what they would do is they would cut all the valuable timber off of the land, sell it. Anything else was just pushed into piles and burned. Then they would drill down to the coal seam, use explosives to blast the rock off to expose the coal seams. They would scoop it up, and then they would take the coal, and sometimes they would reclaim the land. They'd put the rock back, but a lot of times they would just push it on the downhill slope. And that led to a lot of mass instabilities. There were landslides, boulders would come down hillsides, damaging roads, damaging structures and houses, sometimes killing people. There were a lot of water quality problems associated with mining before the law as well. There was massive erosion and sedimentation of streams. There was sometimes acid mine drainage, things of that nature. So the federal government recognized these problems, and they passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977, or SMCRA as we call it. And what they were really looking to do was eliminate the landslides, prevent boulders from coming through people's houses and killing them, and prevent a lot of the water quality problems that were associated with coal mining. So what they did was they required mining companies to restore the land to approximate original contour. They could never leave the big cliffs in place. They had to fill any pits. They had to revegetate the land. They had to declare a post-mining land use. That is, what is the land going to become after the coal had been extracted and they put the land back? Is it going to become forest land? Will it be wildlife habitat, industrial, commercial, rangeland? There are a lot of different post-mining land uses that mining companies could declare. But after the law, because they had to restore the land to what they called approximate original contour, which was they had to put the mountains back in the shape that they were in before the mining occurred, mining companies didn't really know how to interpret the law and how to implement the law. So to prevent the landslides and the water quality problems and things of that nature, they took all of that exploded rock material and they would pack it back up against the hillsides really tight, and they would run over it several times with heavy equipment to pack it in there to prevent it from moving. And then they would seed the areas with aggressive grasses and legumes. They would just spray a slurry mixture of seeds and water and fertilizer over the hillsides. And that would really green everything up. And you get this thick, lush, basically a pasture land of grasses and legumes that'd be about waist high. They would grow up. And that would help to prevent the erosion and things of that nature. But when mining companies declared forest land as the post-mining land use, then they would have to come in and plant trees. And when they did so, the trees would die. So they would have to replant the trees again, and the trees would die again, or they would just be stunted little trees that really wouldn't grow. And what the problem was that when they were reclaiming the land, they had compacted all of those gravels and boulders against the hillside so tight, and then created these thick, aggressive ground covers that the trees really couldn't compete. The grasses and legumes would suck up all of the nutrients. They would grow over top of the trees and smother them. So reforestation failures really became commonplace after the law was passed. And that was a problem. The federal government recognized that. So in about 2004, they started a group called the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. And their mission was to get mining companies to kind of change their reclamation practices to get native forests established on these lands again, to increase the number of trees that mining companies were planting, and to expedite the establishment of native forest habitat on these lands. And they did that through a process called the Forestry reclamation approach, because researchers knew all along that there was a problem with the way reclamation was occurring and how forests weren't coming back onto these lands. So from about the mid 1980s through the early 2000s, mining companies really went away from using forest land as their post-mining land use. They started using hay pasture land or wildlife habitat as their post-mining land use. And they really didn't have to plant any trees. They would just go and establish these big, vast grasslands, which greened everything up. It prevented the landslides and everything else. It did a good job of that. But a lot of these landowners throughout the region, they never had any intention of putting cattle back onto these properties or cutting hay off of it or managing it for a higher and better use as intended by the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act. So when the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement started the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative to get forests back onto these lands, they used an approach called the Forestry Reclamation approach. And what they promoted was to stabilize the hillsides, make sure that they wouldn't move, but to leave that growth medium for the trees nice and loose, that last 4 to 6 feet, just basically the frosting on the cake, leave it nice and loose. Use tree compatible ground covers, and then plant a diverse mix of native trees and shrubs that would restore the forest that was there prior to mining. And in a lot of states, they did a really good job of that. Mining companies went back to using forest land as their post-mining land use. They planted tens of millions of trees after the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative started. But at the time, we're also looking back from that time period of the mid 1980s through the early 2000s and all of those grasslands that had been created. And that was about somewhere on the neighborhood of 1 million acres or about 400,000 hectares of land across the Appalachian region that was forested before mining, and it had been converted to these non-native grasslands that people weren't really using. And then invasive exotic species started moving into them. But because the mining companies had done everything that they were required to do by law, there was no longer any obligation on the part of the mining company, federal government, state government, the landowner, or any other entity to do reforestation of those lands. So we started Green Forests Work as a nonprofit that could get donations, apply for grants, raise funding to do large-scale ecological restoration projects on these formerly mined lands. And since about 2009, we've restored about 6,000 acres so far, or about 2,500 hectares, through the planting of about 4 million trees. And we have to do what we call a modified forestry reclamation approach because we don't have the equipment there, the ground has already been in place. What we do is we bring in large bulldozers to clear off the existing vegetation, the exotic invasive species that are present on the site. Then we bring in a large bulldozer with ripping shanks on the back of it to break up that compacted land. And basically it's like tilling your garden, except on a forest scale. They come in with those ripping shanks and they rip it in 2 directions, and it pulls up boulders and it really fluffs up the land. And then we bring in volunteer groups and professional tree planting contractors to plant a diverse mix of native trees and shrubs that would mimic the forest that was present before mining. And in doing so, it's a holistic approach to reforestation of these lands, because when you rip up the land like that, basically it's like tilling your garden, except on a forest scale. It allows rainwater to infiltrate the soil and be more slowly released from the system so you don't get erosion. It increases the water storage of the land to help prevent flash flooding and runoff and sedimentation. And that loose soil allows tree roots to extend in all directions easily so they can grow to a greater depth much more easily. It creates wildlife habitat, early successional habitat for certain birds and mammal species. Trees are used by pollinators as well. So we get this flush of native vegetation that comes back to these sites as seeds blow onto the areas. And it really restores all of the ecological services that forests provide to society, from clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change, wildlife habitat. We're doing it for all of the benefits that forests provide to society.
It's interesting because I haven't been directly affected by mining erosion and the issues of kind of what you're talking about here is like, runoffs and mudslides and all of that. However, here in Colorado, we had massive wildfires last year, and my cabin, which I've mentioned before, is a family cabin of mine, 140 years old. It was drastically affected not only by the fire, we lost one of the 3 cabins, but because all of the land now looks like a moonscape, there's no trees, there's no nothing. The mudslides, to me, was amazing what we had to deal with, for kind of get people a perspective here. Our cabin, is, a typical sized cabin and house, if you were to look at one. But when the mud was coming down from all of these mountain slopes, going into the ravines and then coming down, that mud was easily 8 feet tall by the time it met my cabin. And so it had crazy floodings and things like that. So when we're thinking about, when we take down all of these trees and then we mine and then we either leave it that way, it's not only affecting people's homes and towns and roads, as you've mentioned, it's affecting the animals and the habitats and everything around it. It's not just directly in that one area. So it's definitely something to address. And as you mentioned, when you're bringing back a thriving environment rather than just kind of a patched environment, really creating a thriving environment from tilling all that soil, as you called it, you're helping the people, protecting their homes from all that erosion from mudslides and so on. But you're also creating habitats. It's really creating a great ecosystem again to help it thrive and continue to grow and support the surrounding areas as well. So I just kind of wanted to highlight that to our audience, is that, when we have these huge patches of lands where people are, companies are mining for resources that we currently need, to rehabilitate that land is incredibly important. So you guys are really helping something that is kind of an older issue too, which I think is interesting. Because, let me ask you, Michael, today, have we learned these issues now with the Appalachian? Are people now realizing, once we're done with the mine, now we need to till the soil? Are companies doing that when they leave and then they replenish with all those seeds and stuff to kind of help the ecosystem grow back?
Yeah, so that's what the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative's mission was, to get the mining companies doing different reclamation practices to get the forests back. And like I said, they did a really good job of that in a lot of the states, leaving that, last 4 to 6 feet loose, planting native trees.
Okay, cool.
But our focus was on that 1 million or so acres that had already been compacted and now needs to be reclaimed essentially so that the forest can come back. And the analogy that you provided for out in Colorado and what we're seeing out in other Western states like California with the landslides and the mudslides after the forests are gone, you're seeing the same thing throughout Appalachia. And some of that is attributed to the previous mining, where we had removed all of these forests and compacted the ground so that, the trees are no longer there to intercept that rainfall, to utilize some of it as they're uptaking it and releasing it to the atmosphere. Well, now you've got all these compacted surfaces. So when you get a heavy rainfall event, it just runs right off of the mountain. And where a lot of the people are living, we're seeing a lot of flooding occurring. And a lot of that is associated with the surface mining. So that's a part of our mission as well, is, to affect the water budget and the water balance of these areas, to restore the hydrology of the land, so that more of it is being utilized up high and being released from the system so that it doesn't just turn into this massive runoff event that floods everything downstream and moves through the system quickly. We're able to work across this large region as well. We're really doing landscape scale restoration where we're able to work with different forest types. So there's been a decline of shortleaf pine and white oak in some regions, and people are concerned about the sustainability of white oak. The bourbon industry, for instance,
Right.
they can only use, they use white oak for their bourbon barrels, and they can only use those bourbon barrels one time, and then it's got to be shipped off for scotch or something else. So they're concerned about the sustainability of white oak, and we've seen a decline of white oak throughout the region.
What you're describing to me, I'm thinking about sort of global impact, global changes. You know, in our lifetimes, we've seen sort of a global awakening to the impacts that humanity is having on the environment, and of course, the most of the awareness really of climate change impact is really more recent, and people are it's more mainstream. What is it that you see is happening sort of in the country, in the US, but also globally, in terms of the way that people's mindset is shifting, and how that's related to the activity that you all are doing as a company?
You know, with the younger generation, they're definitely aware that, you know, of climate change and the impact that it's going to have on them financially, you know, their personal lives, their happiness, everything else. So a lot of young people are really and rightfully concerned about it. And we're seeing this resurgence, you know, in interest in reforestation and ecological restoration. Recently, a study came out that talked about how the planting of 1 trillion trees globally could, you know, absorb a lot of the carbon that's been emitted over the recent decades, and where those trees would be planted. And where we're working is one of the areas that had the highest potential in the eastern US. Our mission is threefold. It's environmental, it's economic, because we're providing resources and creating jobs in a region of the US that historically has had higher poverty rates, higher income inequality rates, higher joblessness rates than the nation as a whole. And then we're creating a future economic base in the timber that will eventually be harvested off of some of these lands. Now, some of the areas, you know, the trees will be on national forest lands, and some of the public lands, they probably never will be harvested, and they'll be more valuable as habitat and carbon storage and things of that nature. The third part of our mission is environmental education. You know, I mentioned that we bring in volunteer groups to help with our tree planting efforts, with our restoration efforts. Pre-COVID, every year we would have about 2,000 volunteers who would come out with us and plant trees. And a lot of those were K through 12 students, alternative spring break students. We've had about 12,000 volunteers who are under the age of 25, and they're really interested in this. They're interested in giving back and learning how they can become the next generation of conservationists. So that's a part of our mission, is inspiring them to take the lessons that we teach them out in the field, not just how to plant a tree, but how native trees benefit wildlife and how they benefit society, and the benefits of each individual species that they're planting, whether it be timber or whether the flowers of that tree benefits pollinators or honeybees, if you could collect honey off of it, things of that nature. So we're trying to inspire that next generation of conservationists who will take the lessons learned through our tree planting events with them throughout their daily lives and apply those lessons, you know, as they go about their daily activities. But we're also tying in with, you know, the whole network of conservationists out there who are working in the same direction. And we're a cooperative organization. We work with groups like American Forests, the Arbor Day Foundation, One Tree Planted, the Nature Conservancy, just a whole host of state and federal agencies and other NGOs who are interested in reforestation. And recently, going back to that trillion tree idea, the World Economic Forum and American Forests are spearheading the North American chapter of 1T.org, whose goal is to plant and conserve 1 trillion trees globally by 2030. So we joined up with that network. We signed our pledge for that, and we're working with a lot of those organizations to look at, how do we scale this work? What does it take to go from planting, the million trees this year to planting tens of millions of trees in the coming years? So we're working with that organization and other ones like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. We're one of the founding 50 of that. And working with these other nonprofits and organizations to share information and help each other so that we can leverage funding and do larger projects that are going to meet more of our objectives.
For everyone who's listening right now or watching, and they're like, I kind of want to get involved in this. I live in the Appalachian Mountain area, or perhaps I want to follow you guys so I can start my own project wherever they're living in the world. How can they get in tune with your cause and your organization so that they can find the inspiration, donate, or volunteer?
Follow us on social media. Go to Green Forest's Work, our Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram. Also, go to our website and take a look at where we're working. If you're in the area and you want to volunteer and come out and plant trees, reach out to us, shoot us an email. Let us know where you're at and which project you might be able to get involved with. And we'd be happy to have you come out and plant trees with us. And we work through all throughout the region as well. So
let me circle back to something that you mentioned before. So with the commitment that basically I don't remember the name of it, but that the government made to reforest after the mining was done, and obviously with the funds that the government provides, and of course that the mining company provides to get that done. In terms of having the financial resources to be able to do the work that you do, are you able to access the help from the government or from the mining companies, or do you depend a lot on donors? What is the most important way for the work to actually get done, so that we can make sure that the good work continues?
When mining companies are, going to mine an area for the coal, they're required to pay for all of the reclamation and everything else. The government, the state regulatory authority, the federal government, they just provide oversight to make sure that the mining companies are doing what they're required to do by law. So we don't provide any funding to subsidize the active mining industry or extractive industries or anything like that. Our mission is on those lands where there's no longer an obligation on the part of the mining company, federal government, state government, or anybody else. So we work with corporate donors, we work with philanthropists, the general public who want to give back, who want to donate a certain amount to plant a certain number of trees for their family or whatever. So our revenue stream is all based on charitable giving and on government grants as well. And, we're optimistic that, with the infrastructure bill and hopefully the Build Back Better, if it gets passed, that there will be a lot more funding available to do this work, because, the sky is the limit with what we could do out there. There's still, probably hundreds of thousands of acres that would be available for us to work on if we had the financial resources to do so. But we've seen an increase in the number of donors that we have every year. People are learning about us through like your podcast. They might hear about us and say, hey, that's a great cause. I'd love to give to it. And so we really see the sky as the limit. When I started on at the beginning, when we first got our nonprofit status, we were planting, I think, fewer than 200,000 trees a year. This year we'll plant, 2021, we'll plant close to 1 million trees. Next year, we'll probably be planting more than 1 million trees. So every year we've been seeing a steady growth in what we're doing, and we just hope that continues.
Especially, those numbers are really impressive because, there's only a certain window to go and plant trees,
Yeah.
So I find that really, really cool. Thank you so much for being on our podcast, Michael. For all those who are listening, take Michael's advice, go check out their Facebook and social media platforms. Please, if you live in the Appalachian area or wish to give, go follow, volunteer, and donate. Really help this cause, because I feel like this is a really cool niche and a really great cause, not only to support, but also long-term effects and how it really affects small communities as well as a global community. Thank you for listening to the GoodViral podcast and being part of the conversation. If you are inspired by this episode, go to our website at goodviral.org, where you can find resources and listings from the episode to continue good efforts.
Like, comment, and share this episode to any or all of your social media channels. It's really easy to take a small action. and maybe you'll inspire a big result.
When good goes viral, the world gets better.